for Tim McCoy.
Covered wagon, the old prairie schooner. Some people call them the ships of the desert, but whatever they call them, these conveyances of the same type that carried the early pioneers out in the first days of the settlement of the West. Whether they went to Salt Lake, to the Mormon Kingdom, whether they went out of the gold fields of California, or to found homes up in Oregon, most of the people that started into the West in the early days went out in these covered wagons. So they have a great place in our history. Now this miniature, of course, it's a fortunate thing that along the trail, at some of those points like this one, people have had sense enough to take some of these old stores and buildings and set them up as museums and gather there so much of the material that was used by those early settlers. Now that's what we have here. Now this miniature of the covered wagon, for instance, look at the detail on that. Everything, even to the handbrake. Now where in a stagecoach or a wagon you ordinarily use a foot brake, on these wagons the drivers walked along the side where they could handle the oxen. So therefore they had to have this handbrake to put on that wagon. Of course, when they got to tough spots, they'd put on what they called a rough lock or a smooth lock with a chain around, of course, the hind wheel to keep them from sliding downhill and overrunning the oxen. And these oxen, hooked as they are with their yokes, the chain running from one team to the other, one pair, the entire string of oxen is known as the team. And you've got the lead pair, the swing pair, and the wheel pair. And these old drivers, when they drove them, you know, with those great long whips, cracking those whips over their backs, they'd holler, gee, and haw, for right and left. When they wanted them to stop, they'd holler, whoa! And that's where the Indians got that word. They heard these old teamsters, or old drivers, bullwhackers as we call them, hollering, haw around there, Betsy, haw! Whoa! So they thought the name for these animals was whoa-ha. So they always called beef after that, whoa-ha. You give me whoa-ha. Well, these people started out, of course, and all of the things in this old store building were the things that were necessary to carry them along the trail. These oxen, of course, are all wearing their yokes. Well, like this one up here, for instance. Look at here. Here's an old-time handmade ox yoke. The bows, the yoke itself, hand-hewn, even the ring is all hand-forged. Every bit of material on that is handmade. You might get this expression sometimes, and in some of the stories, called an ox bow. Well, that's what an ox bow is. Very often the old-timers would refer to a bend in the river that way as the ox bow in the river. And look at the distances these people covered. They would start from Westport and Fort Leavenworth, trail out across Kansas, Nebraska, until they hit Fort Laramie. Now, Fort Laramie, that was the crossroads of their small world. There they'd find other trains that had stopped to make repairs, trade oxen, mules, horses. Some hadn't had the right kind of a start. Their last chance to make repair, the last chance to mail the letters, was Fort Laramie. Then they picked up the trail again, followed the North Platte along until they hit the crossing of the Platte, which is, well, it's where this town of Casper is now, Wyoming. There they'd cross the river. Now, one of the means they used for crossing a river, of course, they could swim the oxen, but they take great logs, cottonwood logs, and lash them along from one hub to the other, and when the wagons moved out into the water, those logs would float them. The oxen swam, the horses and the mules swam, and the wagons were floated across the Platte that way. Now, when they went on, they went through the Great South Pass, that hole in the Rocky Mountains that old Jim Bridger, one of the first to find, came down to Fort Bridger. And at Fort Bridger, they separated. Those who were going to the Mormon country, to Salt Lake, moved on that way. Those that were going on to California, those that went on to Oregon, went by way of Fort Hall, Idaho, and then on up into Oregon Territory. Just think of those distances. Why, it's over 1,250 miles from the river to Salt Lake, and they had another 950 miles on to Sutter's Fort, which is down in Sacramento. And there they were, in their covered wagons, out there where they had to look after themselves, and, well, there's a necessary implement. When a wheel broke down, when they had to grease an axle, here's an old handmade jack. So you ram this jack under the axle, rear up on it, it lifted the wagon, greased the hub, greased the wheel, or else put on a new wheel, let it down, and they were on their way. And there was one of the things that every wagon had to have, a water barrel, because they made some pretty long trips over dry country, and you couldn't be without water. That's what killed some of them going across the deserts, where they hadn't the facilities to carry enough water for the animals, and they died like flies along the wayside. Old wooden buckets, wooden barrels. You know, they had to train those ox drivers so that they could corral those wagons at night. They would be strung out during the day, but when they came into camp at night, they'd start swinging in a wide circle. Then the circle would narrow down until they were all tied in a tight corral. The oxen headed into the inside, the front wheel of one wagon laying against the hind wheel of the one in front of it. They took the oxen out then and let them graze. But at the slightest danger, those oxen were brought back in, wagons were run across the end of the corral, and you had a very tight fort. Now, even in the daytime sometimes, they'd be going along, they'd suddenly be attacked by Indians. The wagons would instantly swing into corral, tighten up, and then fight off these Indians as best they could. The fights went on. Some of those trains had fights every 100 miles or so, and they might happen any time. But in spite of that, when the fight was over, they'd uncoil, come out of corral, and start once more for the promised land. Of course, well, now look here. Your animals had to be kept in shape, particularly their feet. Here's an old horse rasp used on the feet of the horses. And these shoes, horseshoes and mule shoes. Well, now maybe some people don't know the difference. They might think a horse and a mule, well, they both have hooves. Let me show you here, show you what I mean. There is a difference. If you take a horse's hoof, for instance, and the general shape of it is like that, because here's the hoof to which the shoe is tacked, and there's the frog that the horse has on its foot. Now there's your horse's hoof. So the shoe had to be made to fit that, you see. with calks at the heels so that the horse has got something to brace against as he's going downhill. Now your mule, he's got a different shaped foot. It's something like this. So it takes a different shoe for him. See that mule shoe? Quite different. Now you come to your oxen. Now here you've got the fellow with a cloven hoof. What are you going to do about him? His feet get tender too. Well, they shod their oxen. Maybe you never knew that before. And that's the kind of shoes they used. Because on account of the split hoof, they had to use two shoes to that foot, one on each side. Those oxen, of course, after they come out of water, started up over rough ground, over rocks. Their feet would have gotten so tender they couldn't have carried the wagons along. Now those are only some of the details that those people had to contend with on that long trip across to the Promised Land. Well, this covered wagon has played a very important part in Americana. No matter what they call it, a covered wagon, the Conestoga, a prairie schooner, probably one of the greatest thrills that ever came into the lives of any of those people was when these trains were gathered from all the different eastern states. And in the morning, when they were about to start, when the leader cracked his whip over those oxen, and the cry was "Westward ho!" and braving all the unknown dangers of a new frontier, they fared forth in their covered wagon.
Join us for another authentic story of the West when we again meet America's favorite Western storyteller, Tim McCoy.